Deb Friel awoke to an eerie silence. Her heart pounded in her ears and every sense was on high alert. Something was wrong, but in the early morning darkness, it took her a moment to realize what it was. That moment, a split second really, seemed to go on for ages. Then the stillness was broken. Deb Friel suddenly heard heavy breathing, felt hot, sticky air at the back of her neck. Before she had time to register the assault on her senses, she was violently pinned to the ground, an immense weight pressing into her back. She heard a loud crack and thought it was her own bones breaking. Realization began to dawn in her mind. This was a bear attack, and she had been caught completely unaware. It was July of 2010, and Deb Friel was staying at the Butte Campground, some 5 miles east of Yellowstone National Park, with her husband, Bill. It was in fact their 13th night in the area, and their days had been packed with hiking, wide open skies, and above all, fly fishing. This part of the country is close to heaven for someone like Deb, who had loved camping since she was a girl. She had been a campground host in the past and even worked for years as an outfitter, sharing her love of the outdoors with other like-minded adventurers. In all her time spent sleeping under the stars, she'd never found a reason to be particularly afraid. Nature was unforgiving, to be certain, and she knew that a healthy respect was always important, but it was also beautiful, and she felt at home there. After another long day spent enjoying that nature, Deb was ready to call it a night. She crawled into her tent at around 10:30 p.m. She and her husband Bill generally slept in different tents, mainly because Deb had a difficult time sleeping through his snoring. They had pitched their tents around 40 feet apart though, so when Deb lay down, she didn't hear any snoring. Instead, she drifted to sleep to the calming sounds of distant birds and the rustle of leaves blown by a gentle breeze. But at roughly 2 a.m., the night's stillness was violently broken. By the time Deb realized what was happening, she was already pinned by a massive bear, being driven face first into the soft earth. In moments of extreme stress, the human body undergoes some impressive physiological changes, and Deb was no different. Her senses went into overdrive, and she became hyper-aware of her surroundings. She felt the bear bite deeply into her arm, driving her further into the ground and flooding her body with waves of pain. She heard a loud crack and thought surely it was one of her bones breaking. As it turned out, it was one of the bear's teeth snapping off from the force of the bite. She had time to realize that, eerily, there was almost no sound. No growling, no head shaking, no pulling or tearing. Just an enormous, hot vice, pinning her down and pushing the breath out of her. It was then that Deb Friel began to scream. She had hoped that the loud noise would alert people in the surrounding campsites who would come and scare the bear away, but no one came to her rescue. Bill was known to enjoy rum before bed, and he somehow managed to sleep through Deb's entire ordeal. Worse, Deb quickly realized that the more she screamed, the more aggressive the bear became. Frantically, she weighed her options. As a woman in her late 50s, she knew that fighting back wouldn't be effective, and it may even anger the bear further. Then she remembered that she had stashed bear spray near her sleeping bag. She dared to open her eyes and glance around. The spray was nowhere in sight, and pinned down as she was, she had no hope of reaching for it. Her mind reached a clarity she'd never experienced before. She heard the bear breathing, felt its hot breath. A few feet away, she heard a much more subtle sound. Something small, perhaps a worm, rustled its way through the fallen leaves. Deb knew that whatever the bear was doing to her was not normal food-seeking behavior. The bear hadn't come looking for a bag of poorly concealed snacks, and it wasn't testing to see if she was edible. No, she thought, this was an apex predator, and she was prey. She stopped screaming then and tried a different approach. She played dead. Her body went limp, and she hoped that maybe the bear would roll her over to a point that she could reach the bear spray. Then the bear bit down harder. The eerie silence of the attack was broken by another loud crack. A bone in her left arm had finally given way to the bear's immense force. The sound of worms crawling through the leaves was louder now. She didn't know it at the time, but in fact, this was the sound of the bear's 3 cubs joining their mother for the kill. Deb felt another wave of pain ripple up her body, this time from her leg, where one of the cubs had also bit down. And still no help came. The night was pitch black, and Deb realized that her life was about to end. She felt herself drifting away from her body, and slowly it began to feel like the attack was happening to someone else. Then, as if from a great distance away, she heard faint voices, the closing of a car door, the click of a lock. Suddenly, the pressure disappeared. The bear dropped her, and Deb was alone in the darkness, as though it had all been a terrible dream. Hardly daring to breathe, Deb waited. Could it really be over? After about 30 seconds, she reached for her bear spray, grabbed it, and quickly aimed it out in front of her. Slowly, though, she realized that the bear really was gone. She yelled for help once more, and about 30 minutes later, it finally came. But Deb Friel wasn't the only victim of a vicious attack that night, and she wasn't even the first. Moments before Deb had been startled into a waking nightmare, the same bear had nosed its way into another tent just a couple hundred yards up the trail. 21-year-old Ronald Singer, his girlfriend, and their dog were sleeping soundly when the bear intruded. Then, before anyone had time to realize what was happening, the bear bit down hard on Ronald's leg. Fortunately for this couple, the bear's first attack went a little differently. Ronald was a former high school wrestler, and he didn't plan on going down without a fight. He punched the bear repeatedly, and it loosened its vice-like grip on his leg. After a moment, these sharp blows, paired with the piercing screams from his girlfriend, sent the bear lumbering away. His girlfriend's parents, who were nearby, loaded the couple into their car and drove them to a hospital. As they left the campsite, they drove right by Deb, completely unaware that she was also being attacked. It was their car that Deb heard even in the midst of her terrifying ordeal. The bear had brutally attacked people in 2 different tents, and still, the early morning was far from over. After leaving Deb's camp, the scrawny grizzly plodded along the trail. Under the dim moonlight, it spotted another tent and smelled potential prey within. With Deb's calls for help still echoing behind her, the bear led her cubs to their third campsite of the night. 48-year-old Kevin Kammer had traveled from Michigan to visit Yellowstone National Park by himself, fulfilling a lifelong dream. A father of 4, he loved all things outdoors, fishing, kayaking, and, of course, camping. He had pitched his tent in one of the more isolated sites in Soda Butte, near a picturesque creek flowing with clear water. Kevin was sleeping peacefully when the bear attacked. If he cried out, no one heard him. The distance from the rest of the sites and the babbling of the creek drowned out any sounds of the attack. A few hours later, authorities finally arrived on the scene. Tragically, they determined that Kevin had been dragged out of his tent by his head and shoulders and bled to death a mere 4 feet from his tent. The bear had then pulled his lifeless form another 10 yards, and it was here that a deputy found him, partially consumed by the ravenous bear and her cubs. By the time the authorities had located Kevin's body, most of the campers in the area had already been evacuated. When dawn crested the horizon, its light shone on an eerie sight. Camping gear left behind, with police tape and destroyed tents the only evidence of the terror that occurred just hours before. Deb Friel spent 4 days in the hospital, but it would be more than a year of pain and physical therapy before her arm and hand would return to full functionality. She doesn't harbor any ill will towards bears in general, but though she still loves the outdoors, her camping trips since the attack have been less ambitious. Though the physical effects of the attack have healed, the psychological effects still take their toll. While on a more recent camping trip, Deb was once again awakened by sounds just outside her tent. She froze, her mind going back to that terrible night, now in the grip of a full-fledged panic attack. It turned out to be raccoons, but for Deb, the terror was just as real. The bear was eventually caught and put down, while the cubs were transferred to zoos. Unlike many other attacks, though, there appears to be no explanation for what happened. The bear was skinny, but not emaciated. It wasn't rabid, it hadn't been food conditioned, had no history of aggression, and none of the campsites had any food that would have attracted it. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. Put simply, somehow, the bear had come to see humans as food. Authorities determined that it couldn't be allowed to live. Ronald Singer would go on to make a full recovery. Kevin Kammer was the only tragic death of the night, but of course, it hit his family hard. But even with all the damage done that night, attacks like these are incredibly rare. The last time anything similar happened in Greater Yellowstone was in 1984, when a camper from Switzerland died in the park's remote Pelican Valley. Like Kammer, she had done everything right, obeying the rules and keeping a clean campsite, but even still, she had been fatally attacked. The moral of these devastating attacks is simple. When you visit grizzly country, you are entering the home of an apex predator. You can minimize every possible risk factor for an attack, and attacks are indeed quite rare. But no matter what precautions you take, you become a part of the food chain. And with massive, territorial creatures made up of teeth and muscle roaming the wilderness, you will not be at the top.